Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home. Good morning, Dan.
Hey Karen, how you doing?
I am caffeinated and ready to go.
As always, best way to work. All right, so today, speaking of caffeine, right? We're gonna have a little show based on how do we make sure our caffeine is safe in a way. We're gonna talk about the most important element on Earth, which is water.
Yes, the most important thing that any living thing needs is water, right?
Right. And people think it's oxygen, but not all life needs oxygen, but all life needs water.
So, a lot of people in this area have wells, deep water wells, and most of the time, well water is perfectly safe to drink. But occasionally, oftentimes after floods or when there's been a problem with the wellhead being too low, the wells can actually get contaminated. Now, oftentimes the contamination doesn't go all the way down to the aquifer, and that's a good thing. But it's more the piping system of the well to get water into your home. So, we're going to talk a little bit about what potable water is and how to make sure that you're using potable water when you're doing any food processing or washing, but also if your well has a problem, what to do about it.
Yeah, groundwater is funny because it's actually, if you look at it from a risk standpoint, it's smack dab in the middle between surface water, which is the higher of the risks, and city water, which is the lowest of the risks. And there are places that only have groundwater. So you have to be able to manage that to make sure that you are consuming a safe product.
Right. And so this is one of the reasons the Food Safety Management Act recommends water testing. And it's not only just to, make you go out and spend money to do a test, it is to help monitor the quality of water people are drinking and using on ready to eat foods. So, from the perspective of surface water is what is exposed to the elements. And so, for instance, rain barrels, creeks and streams, rivers, ponds, all of those are considered surface water. And the reason for that is if a goose can poop in it, it's surface water. And that includes a rooftop that rainwater might be running off of to get into a rain barrel. So those things, because of that potential for goose to poop in it, you need to recognize that where there's poop, there's coliform bacteria, and coliform bacteria can often make us sick.
I've wow, that's a great way to look at it, Karen. I've never heard that term. But it's very picturesque and it works because that's the kind of risk that you're talking about.
And that's what I'm
Now,
here for.
now, and as for all those water sources, if you're using them for agricultural purposes, if you're using municipal water that is regularly tested, that is treated, and that is piped, you technically don't need to be testing it, at least for diseases. I mean, according to good agricultural practices.
Right, but what you're doing is you're utilizing the city that's providing that water. You're having them test it and give you a form that says it is safe to drink, and that counts as your water test.
Which is why you don't need to test it, right? No, but okay. My point is, like when we talk about these water sources and their risks, you're going to notice that you're going to have to frequently test more often when there's a high risk. So for well water, for agricultural use, for produce specifically, even I would recommend once a growing season to test the well water to make sure that it is safe. So for that growing season, you have to have a minimum of one test.
So when we're talking about water that is considered agricultural water under the Food Safety Management Act, then your testing frequency is going to be a little bit higher than once a year. Now, there's two things going on here, and it's really confusing because the USDA monitors the Food Safety Management Act, which is a law,
Okay.
and the Good Agricultural Practices certification, which is a voluntary compliance thing. So there's two different things kind of going on with what is telling you how often you need to test your water. And right now, you're looking at 4 tests during the growing season or over the period of a
Okay.
year. So you want 4 samples collected as close to practical to the harvest for water that is being used for agricultural purposes. Now, if you're looking at your well and drinking water, it's a little bit different because you're expecting that closed system to remain sanitary, right? But you still should be testing it rather frequently. And I don't know if the health department has a regular advised testing interval for drinking water from a well.
Yeah, I was looking at irrigation water. And then maybe I misspoke when I said agricultural water, but irrigation's what I was
Well,
getting at.
agricultural water is irrigation water, and I don't know why they didn't just say irrigation water because it's typically what you're used. So agricultural water under the Food Safety Management Act is any water that comes in contact with the plant prior to harvest.
And that well, it's once per growing season, and every time it's treated, it needs retested as well. So if it comes back and it's deemed contaminated, non-suitable, there's going to be a chlorination protocol remediation to clean the water, followed by another testing. And that's what's recommended for well water for irrigation purposes. But for surface water that's used for irrigation, quarterly testing is recommended, and it becomes a lot more risky as far as the potential for contamination.
Yeah, so surface water it definitely needs to be tested more frequently during the growing season because of that higher potential for contamination. And when you're looking at agricultural water and what kind of tests you need to be doing, you're looking at doing a test for that gives you a total count of the coliform forming bacteria that are in the water. So you need to actually have them plated out and count the number of bacterial colonies that grow in a certain amount of time. Now, this is really frustrating for people who live further out in rural areas because there is a timeline between when you take that sample and when you get it to the lab. You usually have to get it to the lab within 24 hours, and some tests do go up to 48, but you have to get it to the lab within 48 hours in order to get that accurate test, because the longer it sits in the bottle, the longer those bacteria can replicate and multiply and throw off your counts. So it's really important that if you're doing a water quality test that you know what kind of test you're doing, whether it is for potable water, which is there or is there not, is it yes or no, right? If it's no, then it's not potable. If yes, or wait. If
Yeah,
there's no E.
the other
coli
way.
in the
The other way.
water, it is potable. If there is E. coli in the water, it is not potable. And then there is the agricultural water side of things, or the irrigation water side, where you need to know how many are in there, because if there's a few, it's not that big of a deal. If it's, the more that there are, the longer you have to have for that interval between application and harvest. And so those are all things that we talk about in the produce safety grower training for the PSA network. So our food safety trainings, we go into a lot of detail on that. And they can sometimes be a little overwhelming because it's an 8 hour long class where we just like, okay, this guideline, this guideline, this guideline. And it can be a little much to handle. But that's why we're here to help you answer questions and interpret this kind of information. So when we first started off, we were talking about potable water. So we're talking about what's coming out of your well and coming into your kitchen or coming out of your hose bib to be able to be used for irrigation. Now, this is, like Dan said, in between those risk levels of the surface water
Surface water
and
and
the
city.
city water, right? Which is already treated. So we do still recommend that you take a sample and test your city water at least once a year, because sometimes the actual nozzle at the where you get your water out can become contaminated if you don't have any backflow protection devices or things like that, which you really need to have. Those that can actually cause a problem. So you should test at the source where it is coming out for irrigation at least once a year, even if it is city water. That is our recommendation. But for well water, you're going to want to test it. They're recommending 4 times a year for large farms. And so the Food Safety Management Act only applies to farms that are selling more than 25, adjusted for inflation, probably up to $29,000 worth of produce every year. So if you're selling less than that, if you have a small farm and you're making, $3,000 off of your produce every year, the Food Safety Management Act doesn't apply to you. However, just because the law doesn't say you must follow these guidelines doesn't mean that your farm's liability doesn't need you to follow these guidelines, because that doesn't matter how small you are never exempt from liability. And so we do encourage people to take these classes, even if they don't have to, because just doing what it takes to make sure that the produce you are selling into the food chain is safe not only protects your customers, it protects you, and no one wants to make someone sick. And if you really want to have some nightmares, you can go on YouTube and watch the testimonials on people who have been exposed to foodborne pathogens like salmonella or E. coli or listeria or norovirus. Those are the big ones. Those testimonials can show you just because you don't die doesn't mean it doesn't affect you for the rest of your life, and they can really stick around for a long time.
Yes, there was just a whole lot of information there, and
Sorry.
no, it's good, it's good. But it's just it's kind of like whether you have a pesticide license or not, in a way where if you're required to keep records if you do have a pesticide license, and you have to have a lot more guidelines as far as record keeping and management if you're using restricted products. But if you're misusing general use pesticides, you're still liable. I mean, it's still the law is going to come at you the same way. So,
Yeah, just because you can buy it over the counter doesn't mean it's safe.
or it doesn't mean that it can be misused, and it doesn't mean that it's any less damaging,
Hmm.
which is the
Hmm.
point. You just have to make sure you're doing things cautiously and you're informed. And hopefully, we do our best to get the information out there to make sure you're informed, and that you're not doing anything that could potentially hurt somebody or is negligent, because negligence does fall then on the person doing the act. But let's talk about some of those foodborne illnesses as far as the pathogens that we talk about. Norovirus is one that isn't commonly discussed, but it's actually one of the pathogens that requires the least amount of contamination. Very little infectious dose, less than 10 colonies could make you sick.
Right. And norovirus, while it is not the most deadly as some of the other ones, it is the most commonly reported foodborne illness.
Yeah, less than 10 colonies to be infected. If you just kind of look at the way they broke down from 2000 to 2010, as far as foodborne illnesses go, salmonella comprised about 30%. Norovirus was, it looks like 60, and about 10% E. coli, and then everything else. So the top three, E. coli, norovirus, and salmonella. Norovirus, because it doesn't take that much bacteria to make you sick, is one of the more prevalent foodborne illnesses out there.
Right. And, let's talk about the source of a lot of foodborne illnesses. So, when we're talking Produce Safety Act, we're talking about leafy vegetables and things like that. And your vegetable row crops account for 8%. and that was between 2009 and 2018. Sprouts accounted for 2% of all foodborne illnesses, and root and underground vegetables accounted for 2%, herbs 2%. Really, your big ones are going to be chicken, pork, beef, turkey, and eggs. That's almost half of the percentages of foods that caused outbreak associated illnesses. So your unpasteurized dairy products accounted for 80% of outbreak associated illnesses linked to dairy. So your dairy is 5% of all outbreak associated illnesses, and 80% of that were from unpasteurized dairy products.
And that's why pasteurization is so important and crucial for food safety.
Yeah.
Unpasteurized milk is a raw product that has the potential to pick up a lot of microbes, a lot of pathogens. That heating process for pasteurization is really critical in making sure that those pathogens are eliminated before they get into high enough levels that make you sick. So it's basically just heating the milk so that you get rid of early pathogens.
And that's the main thing we're talking about with food safety and the produce safety world too, is if you can eliminate the source and stop it from being able to replicate. Because let's talk about the food system of the United States here. Recognize that the majority of the food you are consuming was harvested approximately 1 to 2 weeks before you're consuming it. We're talking about fresh leafy greens here, or fresh produce, because it's got to get harvested from the field from a warmer area, shipped on a truck or a boat or an airplane to get to a distribution facility. Then it gets moved to a smaller, more localized delivery system, like a truck that comes to your grocery store. And then it gets unloaded out of the truck into the grocery store storage area, where it then slowly gets meted back out onto the floor where you purchase it, and you take it home and you stick it in the vegetable drawer, or the rotter as we call it in my house, and you put the produce in there where it sits for another few days before you actually get around to eating it. And so between harvest and consumption, we're sometimes looking at a month worth of time for some produce. And for apples it's even longer. A lot of the apples that you see on grocery store shelves have been harvested last season. So it's really important to recognize that the way the American food system is set up currently, with the long distance distribution systems and the consolidated growing areas, there's just more time for the one or two microbes that got on that piece of lettuce to multiply. And the more time that goes by between the contamination phase and the consumption phase means that you're more likely to get to a point where that bacteria has replicated to a level that it can cause a disease or an illness. And so, if you look at the development of foodborne disease outbreaks by year in the United States, you're starting off fairly low, maybe 20, 25 a year, up to about 2006. And then in 2007 to 2009, we almost double the number of foodborne outbreaks. Up to 2012, it doubles again. 2013 to 2015 was kind of stable, but again, 2016 to 2018 again doubles. We're up to over 160,000 multi-state foodborne disease outbreaks by year between the years of 2016 to 2018. And so it's just the way that our food system is set up now, there's more of a risk involved.
And let's back up to the local food system, local foods, farmers markets.
Hmm.
It does. So we talked about water and different levels of risk associated with it. So we talk about lettuce, right? Lettuce is a low growing crop, requires a lot of irrigation.
Hmm.
So right off the bat, if you're using surface water, your risk is higher than if you're using city water.
Hmm.
So there's also the management of how you irrigate.
Hmm.
So if you're doing overhead irrigation, now any contamination is going to go on top of that lettuce and then get in between the leaves. And if the temperature conditions are right, those pathogens have a chance to replicate. You get high enough colony numbers, and then it can make you sick. So there is also an association not only with the risk factor of where the water comes from, but also how it's managed. So, how you're irrigating. So, what we recommend is drip irrigation that'll put the water at the roots, typically a part that we don't eat, so that if there had been any potential for contamination, at least you're eliminating it from a place that is typically consumed. Also, from a consumer standpoint, a way to mitigate the risk for pathogens making sick is to cook the food. So, cooking is another way to destroy pathogens that can make you sick.
Right.
But with lettuces and greens and things like that, that typically we see more often that have recalls, it's stuff that we consume raw.
Because nobody cooks a salad, right?
Nobody cooks a salad, and honestly, even certain vegetables like carrots is one of those funny ones that it can go either way. You can either consume it raw or you can cook it,
Right.
and culturally we do both.
Right.
But there are certain things that we don't necessarily cook as much as other cultures. One is cabbage, but we eat coleslaw, we eat salads. Cabbage is one of those things that we typically don't cook as much as some other cultures. So it just adds a different level of management and sometimes potential risk. It all goes back to what water you're using and how it's managed.
Right. And so when we're looking at overhead irrigation, oftentimes it's necessary when you're starting lettuce seedlings to get that overhead irrigation just to get the seeds to sprout evenly and get a good result. But when you're talking about applying water closer to the harvest time, you really need to pay attention to those colony counts inside of water you're using to irrigate with. And drip irrigation obviously is going to lower the risk because the water isn't directly touching the plant. Now, Dan had mentioned carrots earlier, and carrots are the tricky ones, right? Because we typically eat them raw. They can be cooked, but we typically eat them raw. And carrots, when they're under the ground and you're using drip irrigation, the water is still touching the harvestable portion of the crop. And so you need to be really careful when using surface water to irrigate carrots, even if you're using drip irrigation. And so we had started off this whole thing by trying thinking we're going to tell you guys what to do if you get a bad water test. Like, let's say that your well water, which is supposed to be potable, isn't potable right now because you have a positive result on your test that the health department does. So a lot of times for your drinking well water, the health department in your local area can do a test to tell you whether or not your well is potable, right? And so yes or no means that you need to do something. If it comes back that you've got some, E. coli or coliform forming bacteria in your drinking water, that's panic mode. It's like, okay, well, we need to take care of this. And so there are some things you can do. And one of the things is using chlorine or chlorine bleach, sodium hypochlorite to treat that water.
And it's a bleach that is food grade.
That is critical. And that's important to find on the label because not all bleach is certified for use on food surfaces.
Yes, and potable water, as Karen was saying, has no detectable E. coli. And just to kind of bridge from what we were talking about with microbial water standards for food production and harvesting and drinking, like that whole conversation that we just had, for post-harvest water, it has to be completely potable. No detectable E. coli should be there. So it's pretty much drinking water standards that has to be followed. But for that well water, which for some of us it has to be potable water because that's the only water source we have, there is testing that should be done to make sure that it's safe and that you're not consuming anything that could potentially make you sick. Because you can't live without water, and as scary as it is, water can make you sick. So you have to make sure that your water supply is clean and good. One of the best ways to test for potable water is to utilize the health department to test your well to figure out, is there E. coli contamination? I want to say nitrates or something else that's tested for. So are nitrates getting into your groundwater? But they also test for the pH, the turbidity, so how many particulates are going to be in there. And then, depending on the pathogen load that could be in that water, there is a remediation stage where you can calculate based on your well depth, your groundwater levels, and the pH of your water to figure out how much food grade bleach you need to clean the water, and as far as any kind of pH remediation needed to do with vinegar. And that will help adjust the pH to make sure that that bleach is working really well and will make your water safe to drink again. Usually, a remediation event does get followed by another water testing to make sure that it all worked and everything is safe.
Right. So you want to make sure your pH is correct before you are using a sanitizer because you have to adjust the pH first. Otherwise, it might just absorb your sanitizer and then it's not going to do what you want it to do. So make sure you check the pH first. And, if you're doing this on your own, you can use a simple pool strip test kit and then you can know what your pH is. But you also want to keep in mind after you've adjusted your pH and you're getting ready to add your chlorine that there's a certain amount of time that needs to pass in order to be effective.
Right. And usually it's about 8 hours. So it takes time, but you're not going to be days and days without water.
Right.
Again, there's a protocol you follow. I recommend any kind of issue, any kind of concern you have, call the health department. That's what they're here for. Most wells, well, all wells should, hopefully, most are registered with the county so they can give you the specs, and they can come out and test and make sure that you have a good record on that well to make sure it's safe and potable. Very important to get your water tested, and groundwater is something that some people, that's the only source of water. So making sure that it's potable and safe is very important, if not one of the most important things on a farm or a house.
Yeah, and so definitely keep an eye on your well. Have a system to check it regularly just to monitor so that you're not making yourself sick. And also when you're looking at your food safety protocol for your produce production, you want to make sure you're using potable water for all your post-harvest activities, washing your produce, any last-minute irrigation or any pesticide or fungicide applications, they have to be done with potable water. The potability of your water is really important for more than your crop production. It's for drinking. So make sure you're checking it and monitor and keeping it potable. And then when you get to the point where you're going to start maybe cleaning your produce and you want to have a sanitizer in your post harvest water, your wash water, then you actually need to do a higher level of chlorine in the wash water. And that's a whole nother show. So we're not going to talk about that today, but just be aware that just because your water is potable doesn't mean it has an active sanitizing effect for things that are being washed in it. Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.